Let me tell you a story. It's not one of those quiet, gentle tales you hear by a dying fire. This one's got teeth. It's about the kind of darkness that clings to a person and the sliver of light that refuses to go out. It's about an Apache man who buried his name with his past and a woman who ran from a hell so deep it didn't even have a name. They meet in a forgotten canyon under a blood-red sky, and what they find there, it ain't redemption, not yet. It's a reckoning, and it starts with four simple words that will make the hair on your arms stand up. The sun was bleeding out over New Mexico, painting the canyon walls in shades of rust and fire. The air was dead still, holding the day's heat like a fist. This was Eli Black's world. Quiet, empty. He moved through the sagebrush like a ghost, his eyes fixed on the trail of a wounded mule deer. Meat was getting low in the smokehouse, and winter was coming with a mean look in its eye. He'd been on this trail since dawn, the signs telling a story of a bad shot in a slow death. But then the trail crossed Cotton Brush Creek, and Eli saw something that made him forget all about the deer. Footprints, small, bare, and stumbling. They weren't from a hunter. They weren't from a prospector. They were the tracks of someone running for their life. He crouched low, his hand hovering over the Colt revolver at his hip. The prints were fresh, less than half a day old. He followed them down the creek bed, the sound of his own breathing loud in the sudden silence. He rounded a bend choked with willows, where the shadows clung to the ground like oil. And that's where he saw her. She was crumpled in the mud, a heap of torn cloth and tangled hair. For a second he thought she was a corpse left for the coyotes. Her dress was in tatters, stained with dirt, and something dark that wasn't mud. Her feet were raw, blistered, and bloody. A mess of matted blonde hair hid her face. Eli stood dead still, listening. No buzzards circling. No predators sniffing the air. That meant she hadn't been here long. That meant she might still be breathing. He moved forward, slow, deliberate, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He knelt beside her. Her chest rose and fell, a tiny, shallow movement. Her lips were cracked and pale. He pulled his canteen, poured a little water into the cap, and leaned closer. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You still in there?" Her eyes snapped open, and they were the greenest eyes he'd ever seen. Wild, terrified, and full of fight. The moment she saw him, she scrambled backward, a choked cry tearing from her throat. She clutched the front of her torn dress with both hands, her whole body shaking like a cornered rabbit. He hadn't moved to touch her. He hadn't done a thing. But the look on her face wasn't just fear. It was a memory playing out right in front of him. Then she whispered it. 4 words that hit him harder than a punch. "Don't untie my dress." Eli froze, the water cap still in his hand. The words hung in the air, broken and raw. It wasn't a demand, it was a plea. A plea she had clearly made before, maybe many times. He hadn't made a move toward her, yet she reacted as if his hands were already on her. What in God's name had happened to this woman? "I won't," he said, his voice steady, calm. "I ain't here to hurt you." He kept his hands open, where she could see them. She stared at him, her green eyes wide, not blinking, her knuckles white where she gripped the fabric of her dress. It was a standoff. Him, a man who knew how to kill, and her, a woman who looked like she'd already died a dozen times. Finally, she slumped back against the muddy bank, exhausted, but her arms stayed locked across her chest. She didn't trust him, not one bit. But she wasn't running either. "Got water," Eli said again, holding out the cap. "I'll just set it here." He placed it on a flat rock, well within her reach, then backed away, giving her space. He watched her from the shade of the willows. Her eyes darted from his face to the water and back again. A minute passed, then another. Finally, with a shaking hand, she reached for the cap and drank. It was just a sip, but it was a start. As dusk settled in, turning the canyon a deep purple, Eli built a small fire. Not too close, just enough to offer warmth and keep the night creatures at bay. Every time a log popped or crackled, she flinched. He boiled some water, crushing wild mint and willow bark from his pouch and dropping it in. A bitter tea for pain and fever. When he offered her a cup, she took it with both hands, her gaze never leaving his. He let the silence stretch. let her get used to the sight of him. "Name's Eli," he said eventually. "Eli Black." She said nothing. "I live up north of here a ways." Still nothing, just those watchful, wounded eyes. "You got a name?" he asked. A long, heavy pause. Then a whisper, so quiet he almost missed it. "Ada." He nodded. "Ada. That's a good name." She didn't offer a last name, didn't say where she was from, and he knew better than to ask. That night he gave her his spare blanket. He took his spot by the fire, facing out into the darkness, his revolver resting on his thigh. He could hear her behind him, every rustle, every sharp intake of breath. She didn't sleep. He heard her muttering to herself, soft, frantic words he couldn't make out. Once she let out a whimper that cut right through him, but when the sun rose, she was still there, still alive, and still clutching the front of her dress like it was the only thing holding her together. What was she so afraid he'd find if that dress came undone? The next morning felt different. The air was clearer, the fear in her eyes replaced by a hard, stubborn glint of survival. Eli cooked the last of his salted rice, softening it with creek water. She ate slowly, deliberately, watching his every move. He had to know more, not for curiosity, but for her safety. "You got people?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. She shook her head. "Someone's gotta be looking for you." Another shake, followed by a quiet, devastating word. "No one." Eli let the silence sit. There was a story there, a dark one, and he wasn't going to force it out of her. Later, he hitched up his mule to the small cart he used for supplies. When he turned back, Ada was sitting up, her jaw set. Her eyes, though still wary, had a new focus. "I got a place," he said. 2 miles north. Got a roof, firewood. You'll be safer there." She didn't answer right away. He saw the battle in her expression, the deep distrust of a caged animal fighting against the simple, desperate need for shelter. Finally, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. He moved to help her up, but she flinched away before he got close. He just offered his arm for balance. She ignored it, pushing herself to her feet with a grimace of pain. But she followed him to the cart. The ride was rough, the cart wheels groaning over the rocky terrain. Ada sat stiff as a board, wrapped in the blanket, her hands hidden from sight. She didn't say a word, just stared out at the harsh landscape. Halfway there, she turned her head, her gaze sharp enough to cut. "I ain't weak," she said, her voice quiet but firm as iron. "Just tired." Eli looked at the trail ahead. "Ain't the same thing," he replied. When his homestead finally came into view, a small, squat adobe cabin tucked between juniper trees and boulders, he saw her hands loosen their grip on the blanket, just for a second. It wasn't much, but it was something. A flicker of hope in a world that had clearly given her none. For the first time, Eli thought maybe, just maybe, she'd decided to stay alive. The cabin was stark and simple, but it was solid. One room, a stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a cot against the far wall. A rifle hung over the hearth next to a horseshoe. Home. He stoked the embers in the stove until flames licked up, casting long, dancing shadows. "You can take the cot," he said, not looking at her. "I'll take the floor." Ada didn't argue. She moved across the room like a ghost and sat on the edge of the cot, holding herself so still it looked painful. It was like if she relaxed for even a moment, she'd shatter into a million pieces. Eli ladled some stew from a pot he'd left simmering. Beans, salt pork, squash. Nothing fancy, but it was hot and filling. She took the bowl without a word, eating with a slow, mechanical precision. He sat in the chair opposite, giving her space, not staring. Staring was for captors. Halfway through the meal, she finally spoke. "Your place is quiet." He nodded. "I like it that way." Her eyes flickered to the handmade quilt folded at the foot of the cot. "She make that?" "She did," Eli said. "Must have been a patient woman." A faint, sad smile touched Eli's lips. "She was. And tough. Took the flu in childbirth without a word of complaint. The second one took her." Ada didn't offer condolences. She asked a practical question. "Did you bury her here?" "Out past the pecan trees," he said. "There's a cross made of riverstone." The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the ghosts of people they'd both lost. Your name, she said, her eyes on him now. Black. That yours? It's the one I carry, but not the one you were born with. He set his bowl down, the question hitting a nerve he thought was long dead. He studied her, this broken woman with eyes that saw too much. The fire crackled. My mother called me Neshoba, he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. It means wolf in the Choctaw tongue. Ada's brow furrowed. Not black wolf, just wolf. She said the name was a reminder, Eli explained, his voice low, that a wolf can be part of a pack, or it can survive alone. But it's always a wolf. Her gaze was intense, analytical. It fits, she said. Later that evening, she was resting on the cot, wrapped in the quilt, when Eli stepped outside to chop wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a comfort, a familiar sound in a world that had become strange and dangerous. He'd brought people home before, drifters, injured riders. But this was different. Ada wasn't just lost. She was a survivor of a war he couldn't even imagine. And that stubborn refusal to break, it meant something. When he came back inside, he found her sitting up, studying a dusty farmer's almanac as if it held all the world's secrets. You can read? He asked. I was a teacher, she replied, her voice flat. Back before. Before what? He wanted to ask, but he didn't. He pulled out a worn deck of cards. I play solitaire most nights. Keeps the silence from getting too loud. I don't gamble. No stakes, he said, shuffling the cards. Just putting things in order. He started laying out the cards, the soft slap of cardboard on wood, a steady rhythm between them. She watched him, her expression unreadable. Then out of nowhere, she hit him with a question. Do you think people can come back? He paused, a black 7 hovering over a red 8. Come back from what? Her voice dropped to a whisper. From what's been done to them, and from what they have had to do to survive. Eli didn't answer right away. He placed the 7 of clubs on the 8 of hearts, a small moment of order in a chaotic world. He finished the hand, swept the cards into a pile, and looked her straight in the eye. I think some folks spend so much time trying to get back to who they were, he said slowly. They forget they're still here, still breathing. Ada looked down at her own hands. They were a roadmap of her pain, bruised, scraped, her nails broken. One finger was bent at a strange angle. I used to be Ada Rose Halley, she said, the name sounding like a foreign language. From Missouri. My father was a preacher. He said God's light was in everyone. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. He was wrong. Is that still you? Eli asked. She shook her head, a slow, tired motion. I don't know who I am anymore. He dealt another hand of solitaire, the silence stretching between them again. What was it like? She asked after a while. Being half Apache, half white. Eli's mouth tightened. Depends who was doing the asking. To the whites, I was too red. To my mother's people, I was too pale. Never enough of one thing, always too much of the other. Did you fight in the wars? I fought to stay alive, he said simply. That was war enough. Ada leaned her head back against the adobe wall, her eyes half closed. The firelight flickered across her face, making the shadows dance. I was supposed to marry a man named Paul, she said, her voice distant, like she was telling someone else's story. He had a farm, promised me a garden full of daisies. She took a shaky breath. I packed one bag and went west with him. 4 days into the trip, he traded me. Eli's blood ran cold. He stopped shuffling the cards. He what? For 2 mules and a barrel of whiskey, she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. He said it was just for a little while, that he'd win me back in a card game. He told me I should be grateful someone else wanted me at all. The laugh that escaped her lips was a terrible, broken sound. He never came back for me. Eli said nothing. There were no words for that kind of betrayal. He just stared into the fire, feeling a familiar, cold rage begin to build in his gut. This world was full of monsters. He knew that better than most. They marked us, Ada continued, her voice dropping even lower. The men who bought us. They burned a symbol onto our backs, so everyone would know who we belonged to, like cattle. Her hands clenched into fists. Some of the other girls, they tried to run, They didn't get far. But you did, Eli said, his voice a low growl. I don't know if I got away, she whispered, or if I just haven't died yet. You got away, he said, his voice hard as stone. She turned to him then, her green eyes blazing, wet but fierce. I still wake up and for a second I forget. I forget my body is my own. Eli met her gaze without flinching. You ain't property, he said, the words a solemn vow. Not here, not ever again. A long silence passed. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the fire. Then Ada spoke again, her voice barely audible. I don't think I can ever be that girl from Missouri again, the one who liked daisies. Then be someone new, he said. She looked at him, a flicker of her old fire returning. You think it's that easy? No, he admitted, but nothing worth doing ever is. That night she took the cot without being told. As Eli laid his bedroll by the fire, she spoke into the darkness. Nashoba? He looked over at her. Thank you. He just nodded once. You're welcome, Ada Rose. For the first time since she'd clawed her way out of hell, Ada Rose Halley slept without dreaming, and for the first time in years, Nashoba, the lone wolf, didn't feel quite so alone. But they both knew this wasn't the end. It was just a lull in the storm. The men who'd bought her, who'd branded her, they weren't the type to let property go missing. They would come looking. And when they did, this quiet little cabin was going to become a war zone. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. It was the rhythm of healing, a quiet, fragile thing. Ada Rose started to reclaim small pieces of herself. She swept the floor. She washed the dishes. She never asked for permission. She just did it. It was her way of turning his shelter into a shared space, of staking a claim on her own life. Eli gave her that space. He mended a fence, checked his trap lines, and rode into the nearest settlement, Dry Rock, for supplies. It was a 3-hour ride each way, a journey into a world she wasn't ready to face yet. He always came back with the essentials: flour, salt, coffee, and one small thing she hadn't asked for: a spool of thread, a bar of soap that smelled of lavender, a tattered book of poetry. She never thanked him out loud, but he'd see the thread being used to mend her dress, or catch the faint scent of lavender when she walked by. One morning the air had a sharp, cold bite to it. Eli found her outside, facing the rising sun, her arms wrapped around herself, her breath plumed in the air. Cold? He asked, standing beside her. I'm not sure I feel it anymore, she said, her voice distant. My bones remember worse. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the light spill over the distant mountains. You sleeping any better? He finally asked. A little. No dreams? She hesitated. I still hear keys, she whispered, the jingle of keys on a ring, and chains. But the sound is farther away now, like an echo. He nodded. Echoes fade. That afternoon she watched him work in his small forge, shoeing his mule. The clang of the hammer on hot metal, the hiss of steam, the smell of coal smoke. She didn't flinch from the fire or the noise. When he finally noticed her standing in the doorway, he paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. Ever seen a forge before? He asked. Only the one they used for the brands, she said, her voice flat. It didn't sound like this. It sounded like screaming. He pulled a glowing horseshoe from the coals, the orange light illuminating the grim set of his jaw. Fire's only as cruel as the man who wields it, he said. She took a step closer, her eyes fixed on the dance of flame and metal. Were you always a blacksmith? Nope. Learned it after I left the orphanage in Tucson. Figured if I could learn to shape iron with a hammer and heat, maybe I could learn to shape myself. That night, the sliver of a moon hung in the black sky like a fresh scar. They sat on the porch, the silence between them comfortable now, familiar. Why'd you never leave this place? Ada asked. Eli drew on his pipe, the ember glowing in the dark. Got tired of running. From what? From ghosts, he said. From trying to be someone I wasn't. From trying to belong in places that didn't want me. This canyon, it don't judge. She understood that. Later, long after they'd gone inside, he heard the cot springs creak. A small, choked sob escaped her, a sound she tried to swallow but couldn't. He didn't move, didn't want to spook her. He just waited. Eli? Her voice cut through the darkness. He sat up on his bedroll. Yeah, I can't sleep. He stood and walked to her cot, his feet silent on the wood floor. In the dim moonlight slanting through the window, he could see her eyes were wide, shimmering with tears. I remember a girl, she whispered, her voice trembling. I think she was me. She liked poetry and picking wildflowers. She had a dog named Jack who was scared of thunder. She sounds kind, Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. She was, Ada whispered, but she's gone. He knelt beside the cot, the cold of the floor seeping through his trousers. Maybe not gone, he said softly. Maybe just, waiting. She turned her head on the pillow to look at him. You really think someone can come back from that far away? I think sometimes we don't come back to the same place, he said. We come forward, a little stronger, a little different. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Would you stay here? By me? Just for tonight. I don't want to be alone. Eli's throat felt tight. He just nodded. He laid his bedroll on the floor right next to her cot, close enough for her to know he was there, but not so close it would feel like a cage. Thank you, Neshoba, she whispered. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, her hand slipped over the side of the cot, her fingers brushing against his arm. He didn't take her hand. He didn't move away. He just let it rest there, a fragile bridge between two broken people in the dark. But as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, a sound from outside shattered the peace. The unmistakable sound of a horse, moving slowly, deliberately, just beyond the tree line. Someone was out there. They'd been found. Eli was on his feet in a heartbeat, his revolver in his hand, his body a coiled spring of deadly intent. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. Ada was sitting bolt upright on the cot, her face a pale mask of terror in the pre-dawn gloom. The sounds she'd been hearing in her dreams, the keys, the chains, were about to become real again. Outside, a lone rider sat on his horse, just at the edge of the clearing. He wasn't dressed like a ranch hand. He wore a long black duster, and the hat on his head was a fine, clean Stetson. Even from this distance, Eli could see the man wasn't just passing through. He was scanning the cabin, the smoke from the chimney, the tracks in the dirt. He was a hunter, and he'd found his prey. Get down, Eli whispered, not taking his eyes off the man. Ada slid off the cot and onto the floor, crawling behind the heavy wooden table. The silence in the cabin was so thick Eli could hear the blood pounding in his ears. The man outside dismounted, his movements slow and confident. He wasn't expecting a fight. He was expecting to walk in and collect his property. That was his first mistake. He tied his horse to a low-hanging branch and started walking toward the cabin. He had a rifle in his hand, held casually but ready. Eli cocked the hammer on his Colt. The soft click seemed to echo in the small room. He had a decision to make. Fire a warning shot and start a gunfight he might not win? Or wait, let the man get closer, and pray he was alone? But as the man drew nearer, something about him seemed familiar. The way he walked, the set of his shoulders. Eli felt a cold dread wash over him. He'd seen this man before, years ago, in a different town, under a different name. The man was a U.S. Marshal, or at least he used to be. His name was Silas Kane, and the last Eli had heard, Kane had been dishonorably discharged for taking bribes and breaking bones for the highest bidder. He wasn't here for justice. He was a hired dog. Ada, Eli whispered, his voice tight. Do you know that man? She risked a peek over the edge of the table. Her breath hitched. I've seen him. At the ranch. He works for the judge. The judge. The name landed like a stone in Eli's gut. He'd heard whispers of a man down south, a circuit judge named Marcus Thorne, who ran his territory like a personal kingdom, a man who bought and sold more than just cattle. Kane reached the porch and stopped. He didn't knock. He just stood there listening. Ada Rose Halley, he called out, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. I know you're in there. Judge Thorne sent me to escort you home. Come on out now and we can avoid any unpleasantness. Unpleasantness. The word was a threat, wrapped in a thin veneer of civility. Eli looked at Ada. Her face was ashen, her body trembling, but her eyes were defiant. She shook her head, a silent, desperate no. Eli turned his attention back to the door. He wasn't giving her up, not without a fight. She ain't here, Eli called back, his voice low and steady. Cain chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Friend, I followed her tracks for 2 days. They lead straight to your door. Now you can have this go one of two ways. You can open the door, and I walk out with the girl. Or I can burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside. Eli's grip tightened on his revolver. Burning a man out was a coward's move. But Cain was no coward. He was patient. He was cruel. And he probably wasn't alone. As if on cue, another sound reached them. More horses, moving in from the north, cutting off any escape. There were at least 3 more riders. They were surrounded. Cain had played him. He'd shown himself to draw Eli's attention, while his men circled around. Last chance, Apache. Cain's voice cut through the morning air. Give me the girl. Eli looked at Ada. The terror in her eyes was real, but underneath it, something else was stirring. A cold, hard rage. She crawled over to the hearth and reached for the heavy iron poker. Her hands were steady. She wasn't the same woman he'd found half dead in the creek. The girl who liked daisies was gone. In her place was a survivor, and survivors fight back. He called you Apache, she whispered, her eyes locking with his. He knows who you are. Eli gave a grim nod. His past, the one he'd tried so hard to bury, had just come knocking on his door. Yeah, he said, his voice a low growl. I guess it has. The standoff was over. The battle was about to begin. Stay down and stay away from the window, Eli ordered, his voice barely a whisper. He moved like smoke to the back of the cabin, to the small shuttered opening that looked out toward the pecan trees where his wife was buried. He eased the shutter open a crack. 2 riders were positioned there, rifles ready, using the trees for cover. They had him boxed in. Cain wasn't taking any chances. They know this land, Eli muttered to himself. Or someone told them. His mind raced. Who knew he lived here? The postmaster in Dry Rock? A few ranchers he traded with? It didn't matter now. The trap was sprung. What do we do? Ada whispered, her knuckles white around the iron poker. We don't give them what they want, Eli said, his eyes scanning the terrain, looking for any advantage, any weakness. He saw it. A deep, dry gully that ran from just behind the woodshed all the way down to the creek. It was shallow, but it might provide enough cover to get to the horses. If they could get to the horses. When I tell you to run, he said, turning to her, you run. Head for the shed. There's a loose board at the back. Get through it and into that gully. Don't stop for anything. You hear me? I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice fierce. This ain't a discussion, Ada. They want you. They'll be focused on the cabin. It's the only chance we've got. Before she could argue, a bullet splintered the wood of the front door, showering the floor with splinters. Time's up, Cain yelled from the porch. The assault began. Gunshots erupted from all sides, bullets thudding into the thick adobe walls. Glass shattered as a round blew out the single window. Eli returned fire, not aiming to kill, just to keep their heads down. He was buying seconds. Each second was a foot of ground Ada could cover. He fired 2 quick shots toward the men in the trees, then spun and kicked open the back door. Now, Ada, go! She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes wide with fear and something else. A fierce, protective loyalty. Then she ran. She darted out the back door, low to the ground, a blur of motion against the morning light. Eli laid down cover fire, his shots precise, controlled. One of the men in the trees cried out and staggered back. It was enough. Ada reached the woodshed just as Cain and the other man came around the side of the cabin. There she is, one of them shouted. They opened fire, bullets chewing up the wood of the shed around her. Eli fired his last 2 rounds, forcing them to take cover. He saw Ada disappear behind the shed. He prayed she'd found the loose board. He was out of time. He dropped his empty revolver, grabbed the rifle from its hooks over the hearth, and burst out the front door, firing from the hip. He ran straight at Cain. It was a crazy move, a suicide run. But it was the only move he had left. Cain, surprised by the direct assault, stumbled back, firing wildly. His shots went high. Eli didn't slow down. He charged forward, using the rifle like a club, and slammed it into Kane's chest. The marshal went down hard, the air rushing from his lungs in a grunt of pain. The other man, the one who had been with Kane, raised his pistol, but before he could fire, something small and dark flew through the air and struck him in the side of the head. It was a rock thrown with incredible force and accuracy. The man staggered, momentarily stunned, and in that moment, Ada emerged from behind the corner of the cabin, the heavy iron poker held like a spear. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She lunged forward and drove the sharp end of the poker into the man's thigh. He howled in pain and dropped his gun, clutching his bleeding leg. It wasn't over. The two men from the tree line were closing in. Eli scrambled for Kane's dropped rifle, but Kane was faster. He rolled, came up with a knife from his boot, and slashed at Eli's leg. Eli felt a sharp, searing pain as the blade cut deep into his calf. He fell, his leg giving out from under him. Kane was on top of him in an instant, the knife raised, his face a mask of fury. "You should have stayed buried, Neshoba," he snarled. The knife plunged down, but it never reached its target. A gunshot exploded right next to Eli's ear. Kane's eyes went wide with shock. A dark red stain blossomed on the front of his duster. He looked down at his chest, then back at Eli, a look of pure disbelief on his face. He collapsed sideways, the knife falling from his lifeless hand. Eli pushed the dead weight off him and looked up. Ada stood 10 feet away, the gunman's pistol in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face was pale, her hands were shaking, but her aim had been true. They stared at each other for a long, silent moment, the sounds of the dying and the wounded filling the air. The two remaining men, seeing their leader dead and their partner incapacitated, hesitated. That hesitation cost them. Eli, ignoring the fire in his leg, grabbed Kane's rifle. He didn't need to fire a shot. The remaining men took one look at the dead marshal, at the bleeding man on the ground, and at the wild-eyed woman with the smoking pistol, and they fled. They scrambled for their horses and disappeared back into the canyon. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the groans of the man Ada had stabbed. Eli pushed himself into a sitting position, his legs screaming in protest. Ada rushed to his side, dropping the pistol. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "It's just a cut," he lied, looking at the blood soaking through his trousers. He looked at the carnage around them. 2 men dead, 1 wounded. His quiet, hidden life was over. They had won the battle. But Judge Marcus Thorne was not a man who would take this loss lightly. He wouldn't just send more men. He would send an army. This wasn't the end of their fight. It was the bloody, violent beginning. And as Ada tore a strip from her dress to bind his wound, Eli knew one thing for certain. They couldn't stay here. They had to run. But this time, they weren't running from the past. They were running toward a war. The adrenaline started to fade, replaced by the throbbing, fiery pain in Eli's leg. The cut was deep, down to the muscle. Ada worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady as she tightened the makeshift bandage. The man she'd stabbed was trying to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. Eli looked at him, then at Ada. "Get his gun," he said, his voice tight. She did, picking it up without hesitation. Her fingers didn't tremble this time. He pointed toward the man. "Tie him up. Use the rope from the shed." She didn't question him. She was all focus, all survival. While she secured the wounded man, Eli dragged himself over to Kane's body. He searched the pockets, his hands moving with grim purpose. He found a leather-bound notebook, a money clip thick with bills, and a single ornate silver bullet. Strange. He pocketed the items and pulled himself back to the porch steps, his leg leaving a bloody smear on the wood. Ada finished tying the man's hands and feet. He was moaning, cursing them both. "What now?" she asked, her eyes darting toward the canyon where the other men had fled. "They'll be back," Eli said. "And they'll bring more. We have to be gone before sundown." "Where do we go?" "South," he said. "There's a man I know in a town called Silver Ridge. Carter Lyle. He owes me. He can get us papers, a way out." He looked at the sun already climbing higher in the sky. "We don't have much time. Pack what you can. Food, water, ammunition, And bring me that notebook. Ada moved with a new kind of energy. The fear was still there, but it was now fuel for a fire he hadn't seen before. While she packed, Eli flipped through Kane's notebook. It was filled with names, dates, and figures. It was a ledger of the judge's business. And it wasn't just about ranching. There were entries for stock, with descriptions of hair color, age, and point of origin. It was a record of human trafficking. He saw dozens of names. Jane, from Ohio. Maria, from Chihuahua. And there near the end was a chillingly familiar entry. Ada Rose, Missouri, preacher's stock, traded from P for 2 mules, 1 barrel. The P had to be Paul, the man she was supposed to marry. This notebook was damning. It was proof of everything. And it was their death warrant if they were caught with it. But there was something else. On the last page, scrawled in a hurry, were a series of symbols and a name. Neshoba. They hadn't just come for Ada. Kane had been hunting him too. Why? What did the judge want with a half-breed blacksmith hiding in the middle of nowhere? Ada came back out, 2 saddlebags slung over her shoulder. "I'm ready," she said. Eli looked at the wounded man, who was now staring at them with hateful eyes. "What about him?" Ada asked. Eli's face was grim. They couldn't take him, and they couldn't leave him here to tell Thorne's men which way they'd gone. There was only one other option. He saw the understanding dawn in Ada's eyes. She didn't protest. She didn't look away. The world had taught her hard lessons about survival. "Turn around," Eli said, his voice quiet. She did, facing the cabin, her back to him. Eli took the pistol from her, cocked the hammer, and walked over to the bound man. "Please," the man begged, his voice raspy. "I got a family." Eli looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "So did she," he said. The shot was a single sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls. A moment later, Eli's hand was on Ada's shoulder. "It's done," he said. "Let's go." They didn't look back. They saddled Eli's mule and Kane's horse, loaded the supplies, and rode away from the adobe cabin, leaving behind the dead to be discovered by the vultures. They rode hard and fast, pushing south, away from the life Eli had built and the hell Ada had escaped. For hours they didn't speak. The only sounds were the hoofbeats of the animals and the wind whistling through the rocks. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, Ada finally broke the silence. "You said your name was Neshoba," she said, not looking at him. "Kane knew it. He was hunting you too." Eli stared ahead at the rugged trail. "Neshoba is a ghost," he said. "A name I buried a long time ago." "Why?" "Because the man who carried that name, he did things. He worked for men like Judge Thorne. Not by choice, but he did the work. He was an enforcer, a tracker." The confession hung in the air between them. Ada was silent for a long time, processing this new information. The man who had saved her, who had shown her kindness, had once been one of them. "What changed?" she finally asked. "I was sent to collect a debt from a family," Eli said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A man who'd run afoul of the boss. I was told to take his daughter, as payment. I got there, and I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 16. She had the same eyes as my wife." He paused, swallowing hard. "I couldn't do it. I turned on the men I was with. I got the girl out, but they went after my family, my wife, Ruth, my infant son." His voice broke on the last word. "By the time I got back to my cabin, it was too late. I burned it to the ground with them inside, buried Neshoba with them, became Eli Black, a man who minded his own business." He fell silent, the old wounds torn open again. Ada reached over, her hand resting on his arm. "You saved me, Neshoba," she said softly. "You saved me." He didn't answer. He just spurred his horse on, riding deeper into the twilight. They had escaped the hunters, but now they were being chased by ghosts. And in the unforgiving desert, ghosts could be just as deadly. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a shared secret, a shared guilt, and a shared enemy. And their journey had just become infinitely more dangerous. Because now Eli knew this wasn't just about saving Ada. This was about vengeance. They rode through the night, the moon a cold silver guide. Eli's leg was a constant, throbbing agony, but he pushed it out of his mind. Pain was a luxury they couldn't afford. Sometime before dawn, they found a small, hidden box canyon to rest the animals and themselves. While Ada tended to the horses, Eli took out Cain's ledger again, studying the pages by the light of a small, smokeless fire. The symbols on the back page. He'd seen them before. It was a coded message system his old employer used to use. It took him a while, the memories rusty and painful, but he finally broke it. It was a kill order. His name, Neshoba, was at the top, but it was the reason that made his blood run cold. The order said he was the last loose end from the Silver Creek operation. Silver Creek. That was where his family had died. He'd always believed it was random, brutal revenge. But this ledger suggested something else. It was an operation. It was planned. His family hadn't just been murdered. They had been silenced. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage washed over him. His entire life for the past 5 years, the quiet, the grief, the self-imposed exile, it had all been based on a lie. He had thought he was mourning a tragedy. He had been the target of a conspiracy. What is it? Ada's voice cut through his dark thoughts. He looked up at her, his face a grim mask. They didn't kill my family for revenge, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. They killed them because of something I knew, something I must have seen at Silver Creek. He slammed the ledger shut. Judge Thorne wasn't just some local tyrant I'd heard whispers about. He was my old boss's partner. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more horrific than he could have imagined. This wasn't just about human trafficking. This was about power, corruption, and a secret that was worth killing for. A secret he was somehow a part of, without even knowing it. This man, Carter Lyle, Ada said, her voice steady, in Silver Ridge. Can we still trust him? Eli hesitated. Carter was a relic from his old life, a forger, an information broker who worked for the highest bidder. He owed Eli a life debt, but in their world, loyalty was a commodity. We don't have a choice, Eli said. He's our only way to disappear. They reached the outskirts of Silver Ridge 2 days later. They were exhausted, running on fumes, and Eli was feverish from his leg wound, which was now streaked with red. The town was little more than a dusty street with a saloon, a livery, and a handful of shacks clinging to the side of a sun-baked hill. It was a place for people who didn't want to be found. Eli led them to the back of the livery stable, to a heavy, rust-streaked door. He knocked a specific rhythm. A small slide opened, and a pair of suspicious eyes peered out. "What's the wind's color?" a gravelly voice asked. "Red, if it's carrying blood," Eli answered, the old code phrase tasting like ash in his mouth. The door creaked open. A man with a thick mustache and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow stared at them. His eyes widened in recognition. "Hell's bells, Neshoba. I thought you were a ghost." "Still might be, Carter," Eli said, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "We need out. New papers. Passage on a train east." Carter's eyes shifted to Ada, who stood behind Eli, her hand resting on the pistol tucked into her waistband. She met his gaze with a look of cold defiance. Carter let out a low whistle. "This the reason you got the devil on your heels?" "She's her own reason," Eli said. Carter nodded slowly. "Good answer. Get inside. The less the street sees of you, the better." The room was small, cluttered, and smelled of ink and whiskey. Carter poured 3 glasses. He pushed one toward Ada. She ignored it. "Thorne's men are looking for you," Carter said, getting straight to business. "Word came down the wire 2 days ago. $100 bounty on a runaway girl. $500 on the Apache who helped her." Eli wasn't surprised. "Can you get us out?" "For you?" "Yeah. It'll cost you, though. A lot more than old favors." Carter's eyes glinted with greed. "I need a name, a destination, and everything you've got in your pockets." Eli threw Cain's money clip on the table. "That's a down payment. The names are Margaret Rowan and Emery Grant. We need 2 tickets on the next train to Prescott." Carter thumbed through the bills. "This is good, but Thorne's got eyes everywhere. He's got the telegraph office here in his pocket, the station master too. Getting you on that train without anyone knowing, that's the tricky part." He leaned back in his chair, stroking his mustache. But there might be a way. A freight train carrying silver ore leaves tomorrow at dawn. It doesn't take passengers, but the conductor owes me a few favors of his own. It's a rough ride, but it doesn't stop till it's halfway to Arizona. We'll take it, Eli said. That night, they stayed in the small room above Carter's workshop. Ada cleaned and redressed Eli's wound. The infection was spreading. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his body burning with fever. "Why'd you come with me?" she asked softly, her voice pulling him back from the edge. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. "Because when I looked at you," he said, his voice hoarse, "I saw someone who refused to break. And I wasn't about to let you disappear into the dark." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and a deep, terrifying vulnerability. "Then don't you disappear either," she whispered, her hand finding his in the dark. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise. But as the fever pulled him back under, his dreams were filled with fire, and the faces of his wife and son, their eyes asking a question he couldn't answer. "What did you see at Silver Creek, Neshoba? What did you know?" The answer, he feared, was buried with them. But he was starting to realize that some secrets don't stay buried forever, and Judge Thorne was willing to kill anyone and everyone to keep it that way. The train whistle cut through the pre-dawn stillness like a scream. Carter Lyle hustled them through the dark, sleeping town toward the rail yard. Eli was leaning on Ada, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fever had taken hold, and every step was an agony. "The third car from the back," Carter whispered, pointing to a long line of ore cars. "It's empty. Conductor's been paid to look the other way for the first hour. After that, you're on your own." Eli fumbled in his pocket and pulled out Kane's ledger. He ripped out the last page, the one with his name and the coded message about Silver Creek. He handed the rest of the book to Carter. "Get this to the territorial governor in Santa Fe," Eli said, his voice strained. "Use a man you trust. Tell him Judge Thorne is a cancer that needs cutting out." Carter looked at the ledger, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "This is heavy, Neshoba. This is the kind of thing that gets people killed." "People are already dead," Eli rasped. "Just get it there." Carter nodded grimly and stuffed the book inside his coat. He helped Eli up into the dark, cold ore car. Ada scrambled in after him. "Good luck, you two," Carter said, sliding the heavy door almost shut, leaving just a crack for air. "You're gonna need it." The train lurched into motion, the shriek of metal on metal setting Eli's teeth on edge. They were thrown against the wall of the car as it picked up speed, plunging them into darkness and the deafening roar of the rails. They were out of Silver Ridge. They were on their way, but they weren't safe, not even close. Hours passed. The sun rose, heating the metal car like an oven. Eli was delirious, muttering in a language Ada didn't understand. She gave him the last of their water, trying to keep him cool, but the fever was winning. She looked at the page from the ledger he'd kept, the strange symbols mocking her. She knew this piece of paper was the key to everything. It was why his family was dead. It was why Thorne wanted him silenced. Sometime around noon, the train slowed, the screech of the brakes echoing in the car. Ada's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't a scheduled stop. They were in the middle of nowhere. She peered through the crack in the door. A small group of riders was on the tracks ahead, flagging the train down. At the front was a man in a dusty suit, sitting on a fine black mare. Even from a distance, Ada could feel the aura of cold, absolute power radiating from him. It had to be Judge Thorne. Carter had sold them out. The greed had been stronger than the debt. The train hissed to a stop. Ada's mind raced. This was it. There was no escape. She looked at Eli, pale and sweating in a fevered sleep. Then she looked at the pistol tucked in her belt. They would not take her back alive. She heard the heavy tread of boots alongside the car. "Check every car," Thorne's voice boomed. "They're on here somewhere. I want the Apache alive. The girl is disposable." The door to their car was wrenched open, flooding the space with blinding sunlight. Two of Thorne's men stood there, pistols drawn, their faces cruel and triumphant. Ada didn't hesitate. She raised her pistol and fired. One of the men grunted and fell backward. The other lunged into the car, grabbing for her. She fought back like a cornered animal, kicking, scratching, biting. But he was too strong. He backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow sending her sprawling. He stood over her, raising his pistol to finish her. Suddenly, a shadow fell over him. Eli was on his feet, swaying, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He held the single, ornate silver bullet he'd taken from Kane's body. He wasn't armed. He looked half dead. The gunman laughed. "Sit down, old man, before you fall." But Eli wasn't looking at the gunman. He was looking past him, at Judge Thorne, who was now approaching the car. "Thorne!" Eli's voice was a raw, broken thing, but it carried across the silent desert. "You remember Silver Creek? You remember the brand you used on your silver bars?" Thorne stopped, his eyes narrowing. The gunman looked confused, glancing back at his boss. In that split second of distraction, Eli moved. He wasn't a blacksmith anymore. He was Neshoba. He lunged forward, slamming his palm up under the gunman's jaw, snapping his head back. At the same time, he drove the pointed end of the silver bullet into the soft spot just below the man's ear. It was a move designed for one thing: instant, silent death. The gunman collapsed without a sound. Thorne's face registered shock, then cold fury. He drew his own ornate, silver-plated revolver. But he was too late. Eli already had the dead man's pistol in his hand. "It wasn't just my family, was it, Thorne?" Eli said, his voice dangerously calm. "You found a silver strike at Silver Creek, a big one. But it was on Apache land. You couldn't file a legal claim, so you made a deal. You hired my old crew to wipe out the local tribe, make it look like an internal feud. But someone survived, a witness. My wife. She was Apache. She must have recognized one of the bodies, seen something she shouldn't have." The judge's face was a stony mask. "You're delirious from the fever, Neshoba." "Am I?" Eli pressed. "The brand you used to mark your victims, it's the same one you were using to mark your silver bars, isn't it? To smuggle it out. A brand I designed for you years ago." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The horror of it was staggering. He had unknowingly created the very symbol of his family's destruction. Thorne smiled, a cold, empty thing. "You were always clever, Neshoba. Too clever for your own good. It's a shame. You were my best." He raised his revolver, but before he could fire, Ada, who had scrambled to the other side of the car, let out a piercing scream. "Now!" Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the rocks on both sides of the tracks. Thorne's men cried out, falling from their horses. It was an ambush. Judge Thorne spun around, his face a picture of disbelief. Just as Carter Lyle stepped out from behind a large boulder, a rifle in his hands. "You should have paid me more, Judge," Carter said with a grin. Thorne snarled and fired at Carter, but his shot went wide. Eli took his chance. He fired once. The shot hit Thorne square in the chest, throwing him backward. He landed in the dust, his silver-plated gun falling from his hand. The fight was over in seconds. Carter's men, a ragtag group of miners and outlaws who hated the judge as much as anyone, rounded up the few remaining survivors. Carter walked over to the ore car, his face grim. "I figured you could use a hand," he said to Eli. "The wire about the bounty, I sent it myself. A little misdirection. Knew Thorne would be too arrogant not to come himself." Eli nodded, the last of his strength leaving him. He collapsed to the floor of the car. Ada rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap. "He needs a doctor," she said, her voice urgent. "He'll get one," Carter said. "The governor's men are 2 hours behind us. Your ledger is on its way to Santa Fe. Thorne's empire is finished." Eli looked up at Ada, the fierce, beautiful survivor who had pulled him back from the brink. The fever was pulling him under again, the darkness closing in. But for the first time in 5 years, the faces of his wife and son in his dreams weren't asking questions. They were smiling. He had found the truth. He had delivered justice. He had honored their memory. "Neshoba," Ada whispered, her tears falling on his face. "Stay with me." He tried to answer, but the darkness took him. The last thing he felt was her hand in his, a lifeline in the storm. He had run from his name, from his past for so long. But in the end, it was Neshoba the wolf, not Eli the blacksmith, who had saved them all. And it was Ada Rose, the girl who was no longer just a girl, who had saved him. He woke up to the smell of clean sheets and antiseptic. The world came into focus slowly. He was in a bed, in a real room with white walls and a window that let in the bright, clear light of morning. His leg was bandaged, and the throbbing pain had dulled to a distant ache. A doctor, a kind-faced man with spectacles, was checking his pulse. "Well, look who decided to rejoin the living," the doctor said with a smile. "You had us worried there, son. That was a nasty infection. Another day and you would have lost the leg. Or worse." Eli tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He just managed a single raspy word. "Ada?" "The young lady's been right here," the doctor said, nodding toward a chair in the corner. "Hasn't left your side for 3 days." Ada stood up and walked to his bedside. She looked different. She was wearing a simple, clean dress. Her hair was washed and tied back. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. "You came back," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He reached for her hand, his fingers finding hers. "Told you I would," he whispered. She told him everything. They were in Santa Fe, in the governor's own infirmary. Carter's message and Kane's ledger had arrived. An investigation had been launched, and Thorne's entire corrupt network was being dismantled. The survivors from his ranches were being freed. The names in the ledger were finally being heard. Justice, real justice, was rolling through the territory like a thunderstorm. A week later, Eli was able to walk with the help of a cane. He and Ada were given a room in a boarding house, their expenses paid by a grateful territorial government. They were heroes, though neither of them felt like one. They were just survivors. One evening, they sat on the balcony of their room, watching the sun set over the city. The sounds of life, laughter, music, the rumble of wagons drifted up from the streets below. It was a world away from the silence of the canyon. "What happens now?" Ada asked, her voice quiet. "I guess we get to decide," Eli said. For the first time, he looked at her, at the woman who had faced down monsters and won. The woman who had thrown a rock and wielded a poker to save his life. The woman who had pulled him back from the darkness. "The name on the papers Carter made for you," he said. "Margaret Rowan, the widow from Nebraska. Is that who you want to be?" Ada was silent for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. "Ada Rose Halley, like daisies in poetry," she said softly. "Margaret Rowan, I don't know her. I think I just want to be Ada. Just Ada." "Ada's a good name," Eli said with a small smile. She turned to him, her green eyes searching his. "And you? Are you Emery Grant, the carpenter? Or Eli Black, the blacksmith?" He thought about the fire and the rage that had driven him. He thought about the wolf, the lone hunter. And he realized that man was a part of him, but not all of him. "Nashoba was a man looking for vengeance," he said. "Eli was a man hiding from his grief. I think I'm just a man who's tired of running." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear. "I have to go back," Eli said finally. "Back to the canyon." Ada looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I have to bury them proper," he explained. "My wife and son, under the pecan trees, with their names." "You don't have to go alone," she said. 2 weeks later, they stood in the clearing where the adobe cabin had once been. The air was still and quiet. Eli had carved 2 simple wooden markers. Ruth, Daniel. He placed them in the earth beneath the shade of the pecan trees. He said no words. He didn't need to. Ada stood beside him, her hand resting on his back. When he was done, they turned and walked away, not looking back. They didn't know where they were going. East, maybe. Somewhere with green hills and plenty of water. Somewhere they could build something new. They were 2 broken people, scarred by the world. But they had found each other in the darkness. They had faced the fire and walked out of the ashes, not unscathed, but together. And sometimes that's more than enough. It's a beginning. Thank you for sticking with us through that incredible journey. It's stories like these, about the strength of the human spirit in the face of true evil, that remind us what we're capable of. If this story of survival, justice, and unlikely love moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel more than you know. And of course, if you want to hear more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single one.